So, someone finally said it. Dead by Daylight has a balance problem. I know, shocking. But this time it's not the usual nurses OP or Nerf survivors argument. This one's different. Atstarva, or at least a very convincing lookalike, asked the real question. Some killers are incredibly good at high skill levels, but flop at low. Others do the opposite. How do you even begin to balance that? And honestly, that's a great question. Because if you try to flatten all killers into equal performance across every skill level, you kind of end up killing what makes them fun in the first place. Now, I'm genuinely excited to talk about this. But first, I want to be clear. I know this community has a lot of perspectives, and I'm not claiming to be some final authority. What I have done is study a lot of game design, read way too many dev blogs, and I've played a lot of games, some of which I'm even decent at. And that's given me a few ideas on balance that I think could actually move the conversation forward. If something I say doesn't track or falls apart under scrutiny, call it out. Seriously. But I also think I've got a few good answers to what can be fixed, and maybe some even better reasons why not everything should be. Let's get into it. The more you look at balance changes in Dead by Daylight, the more a pattern starts to emerge. The devs clearly have a preferred playstyle in mind. And the killers who perform well within that style, fast, chase-focused, aggressive pressure, tend to stay strong. But the ones that succeed outside of it, the ones that win with setup, traps, passive slowdown, or map control, those get nerfed, or cause outright system reworks. Skull Merchant is the best example of this. At high skill levels, she didn't chase. She set up drones on 3 gens and played the long game. The longest game. It wasn't fun, it wasn't interactive, but it worked. And the devs hated it so much they removed the entire strategy. They changed regression rules, added anti-3-gen mechanics. Not because she was unbeatable at all levels, but because she was too strong in a way they didn't want killers to be strong. Here's the thing. Skull Merchant isn't the only killer whose design could cause a situation like that if their power was strong enough. Think about Trapper. What would it actually take for him to be viable at high ranks? 10 traps on spawn, instant placement, global pickup? Even then, would that really match a Nurse or a Blight? And more importantly, would that version of Trapper be any fun to play against? Probably not. So maybe that's the point. Some killer powers aren't weak because the devs haven't figured them out. They're weak because the strong version of that power just isn't acceptable. So if you agree that some powers just can't be buffed because they support a playstyle that's too frustrating to go against, then the real question becomes, how do we make those killers stronger, but only at higher levels of play, without ruining the rest of the game? Before I get into actual changes, I want to lay out a philosophy. In a dev blog by Riot Games, they talk about how they approach this exact problem in League of Legends, the tension between competitive balance and character diversity. And there's one line that really stuck with me. Not every character needs to be viable, they just need to be good enough to be playable and fill an interesting niche. If you think Dead by Daylight already hit that bar, if killers are at least playable, and they all bring something unique, then maybe there's nothing really to fix. But that same dev blog brings up something else that you may find even more interesting. In physical sports, we change the rules at lower skill levels to keep the game playable and fun. In American football, you might just call someone down with a touch. In basketball, the 3-point line is closer to the net in college games than it would be in a professional game. And in some third sport, I'm sure they do something equally sensible. The point is, we adjust the rules for skill level, because we know the same game doesn't play the same for everyone. But in games like League or Dead by Daylight, we don't do that. Everyone plays by the same global rule set, no matter their rank. So here's one possible solution. What if Dead by Daylight had killer-specific tuning at high ranks only? Instead of trying to make every killer equally viable across all skill levels, you adjust the environment based on their known performance profile. The killer doesn't change, but the match around them does. At high ranks, for example, Trapper might spawn with fewer pallets and fewer safe loops. Hag might get tighter gen spacing to reward her control. Gen speed could slow slightly for slower killers. I don't like that one, but it could. Faster killers might get slightly wider maps, or with more spacing between their gens. This lets you preserve the killer's core identity without overhauling the power or screwing with low-rank balance. What you don't want with this system is for the killer to feel like a better, cooler, more fun version of itself at high ranks, because then you've just created a rank-based version of FOMO. For example, you haven't really played Pig until you've hit red ranks. That sucks. So if this is implemented, it needs to be subtle, something that you only really notice if you know the game. I actually quite like the idea of pallet spawns, for instance, being more limited for weaker killers, if you want to do this balance. So, not a new version of the killer, just a match that's been slightly reshaped to match what that killer can realistically handle. Now, I'll be honest, I think this is probably a lazy option, and I'm not even sure that it would be less work, because now you're balancing every killer X amount of times based on how strong they are. But it is an option, and honestly, it's the first one I want to mention because it would likely yield the best results. So with that out of the way, before we go further into solutions, we have to acknowledge something. Items, perks, and add-ons absolutely skew the odds in Dead by Daylight. A sweaty medkit build versus a brown trapper add-on loadout isn't a real match. And sure, when both sides bring cracked out builds, you get closer to balance. But the second someone doesn't, the matchmaking can fall apart. That said, Otz was focusing specifically on killer disparity, so let's stay there. And if you look at the killers who consistently underperform, they tend to share one big problem. Their power doesn't let them chase or end chases. And when they do get it down, it's usually with a basic M1. Take Deathslinger versus Huntress. Same movement speed, both ranged, but when Huntress hits a hatchet, that's a hit. Deathslinger lands a shot, he might hit you, eventually. That's a big difference. So how do we fix that? Perks. But not just any perks. Perks that scale better with M1 attacks. If a killer is M1 reliant, give them stronger effects when they land in M1. Longer status effects, shorter cooldowns, or even just a unique effect entirely. And the stronger killers, the ones whose powers are their hit, they barely use M1s, so they wouldn't get the same value. We've already seen a version of this when Nurse had her power changed, so it no longer counted as a basic attack, cutting her off from triggering a bunch of perks. That's a good precedent. Now, do it in reverse. Make new perks stronger when activated via M1. Give them a baseline effect that works on any killer, and a bonus effect if it comes from an actual basic attack. That gives you a new lever. A way to reward killers who don't have flashy powers, without buffing their base kit, and without ruining low-rank games. Now, I want to take a moment to go back to something I said earlier a little bit more directly. Otz laid out a list of 6 factors he sees shaping the current meta. Things like chase perks, longer hook timers, post-hook survivor effects, and the shift away from passive slowdown. And honestly, that all comes back to one simple conclusion. Behavior wants more chases. They've clearly decided the most fun version of Dead by Daylight is one where killers are rewarded for actively pursuing survivors. Not camping, not zoning, not sitting on traps. And honestly, that makes sense. Chases are fun to play, fun to watch, and way more engaging than doing a gen. But here's the thing. Otz's perspective is coming from the peak of the game. Thousands of hours, top, ranked, surrounded by friends who play just as much. So when he says things like, my friend ran no perks nurse and did better than me running meta on Trapper, it's important to realize that's not the average experience. Most nurses or blights don't execute as well as he normally sees. Take 2 regular players and ask them to try that experiment, you're probably going to get a pretty different result. Behavior isn't trying to create a hyper-competitive ladder. They're building something fun for as many players as possible. So any balanced discussion has to respect what Behavior actually wants from their game. That said, Otts made one point I absolutely agree with. The strongest killers need to be looked at, and they all seem to have one thing in common: mobility. Killers with chase powers often double as the best map traversal killers in the game. Nurse completely ignores verticality in a way no other killer can. Blight zips across the map in seconds. The newest killer, Kaneki, is basically Spider-Man. Meanwhile, killers like Trapper or Myers, they walk. Now, mobility isn't the problem on its own, but it should come with trade-offs. And some killers actually do model this well. Take Spirit. She has excellent traversal with her phase walk, but if she uses it to cross a large distance, it comes with a cost. A full 15-second cooldown. End the phase early, though, it recharges faster. That's a clean, elegant trade-off. You can use it for movement or for chase pressure, but not for both and not for free. That's the kind of design I'd love to see more of. Now, contrast that with Blight. His cooldown is at most 10 seconds, and he can often correct mid-power to land a hit if he sees you. So either that mobility needs a longer cooldown, or it needs to be difficult enough to control that you can't reliably convert it into a hit. Because right now, the top killers don't just perform in chases. They start them instantly, on their terms, and still have enough gas to finish the job. That's a lot of free value, and that's where behavior needs to focus. If the game is going to reward active chasing, and clearly it is, then traversal needs to cost something. Either your mobility limits your follow-up, or your chase strength limits your ability to cross the map. But when you get both, that's where imbalances start to spiral, and the fix doesn't have to be massive. A few smart tweaks to how and when you can use traversal, especially on the top tier killers, could go a long way. After all that, what should balance actually look like in a game like Dead by Daylight? First off, not every killer needs to be equal at every skill level. That's not just unrealistic, it's counterproductive. Flattening the roster until everyone performs the same is a great way to kill what makes each killer unique. But that doesn't mean balance is off the table. In fact, we've talked about a bunch of ways the game could be nudged in the right direction. Match tuning that adjusts based on MMR, perks that scale better for M1 reliant killers, chase powers that come with actual trade-offs when used for mobility. Those aren't theory craft. Those are real, grounded changes that could improve the experience without gutting identity or low-rank balance. And yeah, some killers probably do just need some quality of life help. A smoother setup, a tighter hitbox, some extra agency. The fact that a killer is strong at low MMR shouldn't be a hard veto on giving them tools that only benefit better players. We just need to be intentional about how we deliver that strength. Like Hag. Right now, if you hook someone or kick a gen, survivors can just run around triggering every trap you set. You have no control over it. Even just being able to toggle traps, choose whether they activate or not, would fix that. It's not a buff to power, it's a fix to control. And that alone would give her a lot more agency at higher levels. But at the end of the day, this video isn't about specific buffs or nerfs. It's about philosophy. It's about shifting the conversation from make everything equally viable to make everything have a place. Balance doesn't mean making every killer the same, it means making sure none of them are wasted. You know, it would be super cool if Otts actually sees this video and it gains traction because, back in the day, God, when I was in, middle school, I would watch Dark Souls PvP content all the time. Anyway, I hope you all have a great day. See ya.